She arrived at that train station with nothing, no job, no name that mattered to anyone, and barely enough coins to get herself home. They threw her out like she was something that had never belonged in the first place. And maybe she believed them. Maybe, for one terrible night in the Wyoming cold, she almost let them win. But then a stranger sat down across from her with two grieving boys and a ranch on the edge of ruin, and something shifted. This is the story of a woman who was written off, left behind, and still chose to stay. If this story finds you, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this one travels. The December cold in Casper had teeth. Savannah Hale learned that the hard way, standing on the back step of the Aldridge estate with her traveling bag pressed against her chest, and the door still rattling shut behind her. She hadn't been given a coat. She'd left hers inside, hanging on the hook beside the servant's entry, and she wasn't going back in to get it. Not after what Margaret Aldridge had just said to her in front of the entire household staff. "You're not what we pictured. I think you understand." She didn't understand. That was the honest truth. Savannah had answered every question correctly during the correspondence. She had 3 solid letters of reference from families in Cheyenne, 2 of them prominent enough that the Aldridges had written back within 4 days, which almost never happened. She had traveled 230 miles on a savings she'd been building since April, and she had stood in that parlor with her back straight and her hands folded and answered Margaret Aldridge's questions with patience and care, right up until the moment the woman's expression soured like she'd bitten into something wrong. We were expecting someone more presented. Savannah had rolled that word around in her mind the whole time she was being walked to the back door by a housemaid who wouldn't meet her eyes. Presented. She knew what it meant. She'd heard versions of it her whole life, wrapped in different language each time. Too plain, too quiet, doesn't carry herself right. None of those things had anything to do with how well she could manage a household, organize a kitchen, or raise someone else's children with patience and genuine warmth. But none of those things had ever mattered as much as the first impression of her face. She stood in the cold and breathed. The grounds behind the Aldridge estate were bare and gray, dead grass, frozen mud, the skeletal remains of a garden that had probably been impressive in summer. A stable hand was crossing the yard some distance away, and he glanced over at her once, then looked away. Not his problem. Savannah picked up her bag, squared her shoulders, and walked around the side of the house toward the main road. She had enough money for a train ticket. That was what she kept telling herself as she walked the half-mile into town with the wind cutting through her blouse like it had somewhere to be. She had enough for a ticket and maybe a meal, and she would go back to Cheyenne and she would figure out what came next from there. She was 31 years old. She had figured out what came next before. She could do it again. The Casper train depot was a low wooden building that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. It was not crowded at that hour. Late afternoon sliding toward evening, the kind of light that turned everything the color of old tin. A clerk behind the grilled window sold her a ticket for the 6:40 eastbound with barely a word, just slid her change back through the slot and went back to his ledger. Savannah took her ticket and found a seat on a bench near the far wall, away from the door where the draft came in. The train, she was informed when she asked, was running late. Not unusual for December. Could be an hour, could be 2. She settled in to wait. There were a handful of other people in the depot. A family with too much luggage and not enough patience, the parents snapping at each other in low, tired voices, while 2 young children ran circles that nobody had the energy to stop. An older man asleep in the corner with his hat pulled down. A woman in a black traveling dress who read the same page of her book 4 times without turning it, Savannah noticed, which meant she wasn't really reading at all. Savannah wasn't really reading either. She'd taken out the small notebook she kept in her bag. More habit than anything else. She used it to write down things she needed to remember, practical things mostly, lists and small observations. And she opened it to a blank page and sat there with her pencil and didn't write anything. 230 miles, 4 months of careful saving, 3 letters of reference. And Margaret Aldridge had looked at her face and decided in under 3 minutes. She pressed the eraser end of the pencil against the paper and didn't cry. She'd made herself a rule about crying in public places a long time ago, not out of pride exactly, but because once you started, it was hard to stop, and this was not the place to fall apart. She would be home, or what passed for home, in Cheyenne by midnight. She would sleep. She would figure it out in the morning. The depot door opened and a gust of December air came in with it, along with a man and two boys. Savannah noticed them because the boys were loud. Not the shrieking kind of loud that set teeth on edge, but the specific noise of two children arguing about something with genuine conviction, pushing at each other's shoulders as they came through the door. They looked identical at first glance. Same dark hair, same sharp jawline, same boots caked in the same pale mud. Maybe 9 or 10 years old, she thought. Twins, almost certainly. The man behind them was saying, "Both of you, enough," in a voice that was firm but tired in a particular way. The tiredness of someone who said the same thing often and knew it wasn't going to land this time either. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed. Tall, with the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than anything deliberate. He had a good coat, not fancy, but heavy and well-kept. And his hat was pushed back a little, the way men's hats went when they'd been running their hands through their hair. He had a canvas travel bag over one shoulder and a look on his face that Savannah recognized without being able to name it precisely. Not anger, something underneath anger, something worn down. The boys flung themselves onto a bench across the narrow aisle from Savannah without looking at her. The louder of the two, the one who'd been arguing more aggressively, she thought, immediately started kicking the bag under the seat. The other one went still, quiet in a way that was different from calm. Their father stopped at the ticket window, said something low to the clerk, then turned and looked for a place to sit. The bench beside his boys was full of bags. He glanced across the aisle at Savannah, at the empty space beside her, and she shifted her bag slightly in the automatic way of someone making room. He sat down at the far end of the bench, leaving a proper distance between them, and pulled his hat off and set it on his knee. For a few minutes, nobody said anything. The loud boy had moved on from kicking the bag to trying to flick his brother's ear, and his brother had gone somewhere far away behind his eyes that made it clear he wasn't entirely present in the room. "Luke?" The man's voice was quiet, but the boy stopped. "I mean it." Luke made a face that communicated he found this deeply unfair but subsided. The quiet boy, Owen, Savannah would learn much later, continued to stare at nothing in particular. There was something about the stillness of him that made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't explain. Not troubled exactly, just too still for a child his age. 6:40's delayed, the man said, not to anyone in particular. Probably know that already. Savannah wasn't sure if he was speaking to her. She looked up from her blank page. They said an hour, maybe 2. He nodded, looking forward at the wall. Figures. That was the end of it for a while. The family with too much luggage left. The sleeping man in the corner shifted, coughed, didn't wake. Outside the light finished dying and the windows turned black and reflective. The depot interior ghosting back at them in the glass. Luke had produced something from his coat pocket, a folded piece of paper that he was trying to turn into some kind of shape, with limited success and increasing frustration. His brother watched him from the corner of his eye, still not speaking. Savannah watched too, without meaning to, until Luke made a sound of genuine despair and threw the paper down on the bench. "I can't get the ears right," he said, to no one in particular, or maybe to his brother. His brother didn't answer. Their father was looking at something in his bag and didn't seem to have heard. Savannah looked at the crumpled paper on the bench. "What are you trying to make?" Luke looked at her like he'd forgotten she was there. He had his father's coloring, but his own expression, wide open, not guarded at all, the kind of face that showed everything. "A horse," he said. "Owen showed me how to do it once, but I forgot the ears." She set down her notebook. "Can I see?" He handed her the paper without hesitation, which told her something about him. She unfolded it and smoothed it out against her knee. The basic shape was there. He had the body right, actually, and the head was decent. "The trick with the ears is you fold this edge back first," she said, demonstrating. "Then tuck it under rather than over. See?" Luke leaned in, watching her hands. Across from him, Owen had drifted a fraction closer, almost imperceptibly, the way a cat approaches something interesting while pretending not to. She finished the horse and held it up. It was simple. Paper origami was not high art, but it had something recognizable about it. Luke grabbed it immediately and held it out to his brother. "Look." Owen looked at it. His expression shifted, the faintest thing, and he reached out and touched one of the paper ears with one finger. "He doesn't talk much," Luke said, conversational about it, the way children sometimes are about the heaviest things. Since our mom died, that was in February. Savannah didn't know what to do with that exactly. She said, "I'm sorry," and meant it. "Dad says he'll talk when he's ready." Luke shrugged, the gesture practiced in the way children copy adult gestures. "I think he just forgot how." Across the aisle, the man had gone still in his bag. She had the sense he'd been listening. His name was Rhett Mercer, and he offered it eventually, about 40 minutes into the wait, when the lamp above their section of the depot sputtered and needed adjusting, and they both reached for the bracket at the same time and laughed a small, awkward laugh. Rhett Mercer. He sat back down. "These two disasters are Owen and Luke." "Savannah Hale." She adjusted her bag. "I heard about the horse from Luke." He looked across at his sons. Luke was now attempting to teach Owen the origami fold with limited success. Owen's hands moving slowly, following, which was something. "Yeah." Something passed across his face. February was a hard month. She nodded and didn't push it. He didn't ask why she was traveling alone or what had brought her to Casper, which she appreciated. He told her he'd been in town for a bank meeting that had not gone particularly well, and the way he said "not particularly well" suggested that was an understatement in the manner of a man who had learned to keep the full measure of bad news to himself. "Ranch?" she asked. "South of Laramie. About 60 acres, bit more with the grazing land." He rolled the brim of his hat between his hands. "Water access that every man in the county wants, which sounds like an asset until it isn't." She understood enough about frontier land disputes to read between those lines. "Someone pressuring you?" He looked at her sideways, a little surprised at the directness. "Silas Crow." "You know the name?" She didn't. He nodded like that was the right answer, the safer answer. "He's been patient about it," Rhett said. "That's what worries me. Patient men are more dangerous than impatient ones." Savannah thought about Margaret Aldridge's face at the parlor door and decided she was too tired to disagree with that assessment. The train whistle came through the wall a little after 8 o'clock, which meant it was running closer to 2 hours late. Luke had fallen asleep against his brother's shoulder in the way of children who fight sleep right up until they lose. Owen was awake, the paper horse held loosely in his hand. Rhett stood and started gathering their bags. Savannah began gathering hers. "Where are you headed?" he asked, not prying about it, just the natural end of a conversation between strangers in a waiting room. "Cheyenne?" She buckled the clasp on her bag. "Back where I started." He was quiet for a moment, shifting the strap of the canvas bag. "The situation there good?" She almost laughed, but it would have come out wrong. "Not particularly." He looked at her then, really looked, the way people rarely did, not assessing her appearance or measuring something behind her eyes, just looking at her the way you look at something you're trying to understand honestly. "I've got a lot of work," he said. "More than I can manage with just the boys. Cooking, organizing. I don't mean laboring, I mean keeping the household running. I had a woman who helped, but she left last month." He stopped. Seemed to be deciding something. "I can't pay much, but there's a room and meals and it's steady until, well, until the spring anyway." She looked at him. "That's not an offer I make lightly," he said, in a tone that made her believe him. "And you don't know me from a rail post, so you have no reason to take it, but you seem like someone who handles herself, and I could use someone who handles herself." "You don't know that," Savannah said. "You've known me for 2 hours." "You fixed my son's paper horse, and he watched you with both eyes," Rhett said. "That's more than most people get from him." It was not, by any reasonable accounting, a solid basis for a major decision. She was aware of that. She was also aware that the alternative was Cheyenne and a savings account she'd just mostly spent, and a city where the only real thing waiting for her was the need to start over in exactly the same conditions that had produced exactly this outcome. The train was boarding. "I would need my own room," she said. "A clear arrangement, and if it doesn't work, I leave." "All of that," he agreed without hesitation. Owen, still sitting on the bench, had turned to look at her. The paper horse was still in his hand, and he was watching her with those quiet, careful eyes that already held something older than a 10-year-old should have been carrying. She picked up her bag. "All right," Savannah Hale said. "I'll come." The train south and east ran through country that was beautiful and indifferent in equal measure. Wide plains going pale under snow, outcroppings of rock rising black against the sky, the occasional cluster of lights from some settlement that was too small to have a name on any map she'd seen. Savannah sat beside the window and watched it go by and tried to decide if she'd made a reasonable decision or a desperate one. She kept landing on both and deciding that wasn't necessarily disqualifying. Luke slept the entire way, folded into his seat like a dropped coat. Owen stayed awake, quiet, the paper horse on his knee. Across the aisle, Rhett had papers out, actual papers, figures, and columns. And he was going over them with the specific stillness of someone who had been looking at the same numbers for weeks and still hoping they would rearrange themselves into something better. She didn't look at the papers. It wasn't her business. But she noticed the way his jaw set as he read, the way he folded the papers carefully and put them back in his jacket, with a movement that had a quality of someone putting something away rather than setting it down. The quality of someone managing. She'd seen that look on her father's face years ago. She recognized the architecture of it. He caught her looking, and she glanced away, but not before he'd seen her see it. He didn't seem bothered, just said, "It'll work out," in a flat tone that was the verbal equivalent of folding those papers back up. "I didn't say it wouldn't," she replied. He made a sound that might have been a brief laugh. "No, you didn't." Outside the window, the snow had started falling again, soft and relentless, covering the tracks behind them as fast as the train made them. The landscape blurred white. Bye? The Mercer Ranch presented itself at dawn. Rhett drove them in a wagon from the Laramie station, through roads that were more suggestion than fact by that point, the snow from the night before smoothing everything to the same unbroken white. The boys were awake, Luke bouncing in his seat and narrating everything they passed for an audience of no one in particular. Owen sat next to Savannah and was quiet. She got her first real look at the place as they crested a low ridge, and the ranch spread below them in the early gray light. It was not the grand spread of her imagination. 60 acres sounded like a lot, until you were standing above land that had been working itself to exhaustion for 20 years. The main house was solidly built. 2 stories, a covered porch that went all the way around, stone chimney, but it had the look of a place that had received necessary repairs and not much else. The barn was large and functional. 2 smaller outbuildings sat at odd angles to each other, one of them with a section of roof that had been patched with wood of a slightly different color. The fencing that was visible from the ridge was intact, but she could see beyond it, further out, where posts leaned and wire ran slack. A hand emerged from the barn as the wagon came down the track. A man in his 50s, heavy-set, with the careful walk of someone whose knees had long complaints. He lifted a hand to Rhett, looked at Savannah without expression, and went back inside. "That's Gus," Rhett said. "He's been here longer than the fence posts. Don't read much into how he looks at you. He looks at everything that way." She nodded. The house was cold inside, which meant the fire had been banked down for days. She stood in the front room while Rhett got the boys settled upstairs, and she looked around at what was there. The practical furniture of people who needed to use things, not show them, the shelf of books that had clearly been read and reread, the photographs on the mantel that she looked at only briefly and then looked away from. There was a woman in one of the photographs, dark-haired, laughing at something off to the side, with Owen and Luke much younger in front of her, Luke squinting against the sun, Owen looking directly at the camera with that same serious face he still wore at 10. Savannah looked at the fireplace instead. Rhett came back downstairs and showed her the room she'd have. Small, off the kitchen, with a window that faced east and a bed that was narrow but real, and a chest of drawers that had a sticky bottom drawer, he demonstrated forcing open like it was an important piece of practical information. The quilt on the bed was someone's careful work, faded but intact. "The kitchen needs sorting," he said, standing in the doorway. "And the pantry. We've been managing, but managing's not the same as running." "I can see that," she said, not unkindly. He looked at her for a moment. "I don't know if I said, I know this isn't what you were headed toward. What brought you to Casper, I mean?" She set her bag on the bed. "No, it isn't." He seemed to want to say something else, and then decided against it. "I'll let you get settled. Gus will have something started for breakfast, or he'll claim he does anyway." He left. She heard his boots on the floor, then on the stairs, then the particular quietness of a house that wasn't used to having someone new in it. She stood in the room and looked at the east window. The sky beyond it was turning from gray to pale gold, the first real color of the morning, and the snow outside the glass caught it and held it and threw it back at an angle that was almost extravagant against all that white. She thought about Cheyenne. She thought about the Aldridge back door and the draft through her blouse, and the clerk at the ticket window who hadn't looked at her. She thought about Owen's hand reaching out to touch the ear of a paper horse. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook behind the door. The first week was an education in the specific chaos of a household that had been run by men who were doing their honest best and falling short in the ways that men often did. The pantry was a system that had been a system once and had since become an archaeology project. The kitchen had good bones, solid stove, decent work table, but it had accumulated the particular disorder of meals made under time pressure and not cleaned up until after. Savannah started with the pantry. It took most of the first day just to take stock of what was there and what was past using, and to scrub the shelves that had accumulated the residue of years. She didn't complain about it. She'd cleaned worse. She organized what remained, made a list of what they needed, and set a pot of something on the stove that smelled like food rather than necessity. Gus ate the soup at the kitchen table that evening without comment. Luke ate it with the enthusiasm of a boy who had been subsisting on whatever Gus could be convinced to make. Owen ate about 2/3 of his bowl and stopped. She didn't push him. Rhett came in from whatever the late afternoon had demanded of him and stopped in the kitchen doorway with an expression she couldn't entirely read. He looked at the bowl she'd set at his place, at the bread beside it that was real bread and not hardtack. "You didn't have to do all this today," he said. "I know." She sat down with her own bowl. "Eat before it goes cold." He sat down. He ate. Nobody talked much, which was fine. She'd learned early that not all silence was awkward. Some of it was just tired people eating together, which was its own kind of companionship. Later, when the boys were upstairs and Gus had gone to his bunk in the outbuilding, Rhett stayed at the table with his coffee, and she stayed with hers, and they talked in the quiet way of people working out the practical terms of a new arrangement. "What are the most urgent things?" she asked. He thought about it honestly rather than reflexively minimizing. "The account with the Laramie supply store. We're running short and I need to renegotiate terms before spring." He turned the cup in his hands. "The east fence line. 3 sections of it have gone down and I can't get ahead of it." "Gone down how?" He looked at her. "Like something helped it along." She understood what that meant. "Crow. Can't prove it." His voice had that flat quality again. "That's the whole problem. Can't prove any of it directly. Gus had a conversation with the hand we lost last month. Apparently there was an offer. Better pay, right place to stay, nothing illegal about it." He set down the cup. "He's patient," Rhett said again. The same word he'd used at the depot, with the same weight behind it. "Patience ends," Savannah said. That's the nature of it." "I know." He stood, started to clear his cup. "I just don't know what it ends into." After he went upstairs, she sat alone at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and the list she'd made of what the pantry needed, and let herself think clearly, the way she hadn't been able to do on the train or in the wagon or in any of the hours since she'd walked away from the Aldridge back door. She was here. That was the fact of it. She had said yes in a train depot to a man she didn't know, and she was here in his kitchen in Wyoming at 9 o'clock at night, and the boys were upstairs, and the east fence was down, and there was a powerful man somewhere in this county who wanted this land. She wrote fence repair, who can be hired at the bottom of her pantry list. It wasn't her problem. She knew that. She was hired help, temporarily, until spring. She folded the list and put it in her pocket anyway. Owen spoke to her for the first time on a Thursday morning, 9 days after she arrived. She'd been careful not to push him. She'd watched how he moved through the house, low traffic patterns, close to walls, like a boy who had learned to take up less space as a means of management. He watched her, though. She'd catch it in the corner of her eye, that particular quality of being observed by someone who didn't want to be caught doing it. She'd been reading the situation and decided the key was not to make herself something to be approached, to just be present and useful and unremarkable, and let him come to whatever conclusions he was going to come to in his own time. On Thursday morning, she was in the kitchen before dawn, working on a ledger she'd started to track the household accounts. She'd found the existing records in a box in the pantry, 2 years of bills and receipts and tallies kept in Rhett's handwriting, organized with the efficiency of a man who was keeping track of a problem, getting worse, and didn't know how else to respond to it. She'd asked Rhett if she could look at them. He'd said yes with a look that was partly surprised and partly something else. Owen came downstairs while she was working, which wasn't unusual. He woke early, she'd noticed, earlier than Luke, and he usually went to the kitchen for water. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, still in the mode of expecting an empty room. She didn't look up from the ledger. He got his water. She heard him drink it. She wrote a number. Then, "What are you doing?" His voice was rougher than she expected. Not from disuse exactly, but like a voice that wasn't sure how to work anymore, that had to think about it. She looked up, careful not to make it a big thing. "Looking at your father's accounts." He came closer, looked at the ledger from across the table. Why? Trying to understand what he's working with. She turned the ledger slightly so he could see it better. Numbers tell a story, not always a good one, but at least an honest one. He studied the columns. Dad doesn't like people looking at those. He said I could. She pointed to a line. See this? That's the water access fee for the south pasture. It's been the same amount for 4 years. He looked at where she was pointing. So everything else has gone up. She turned a page. Every supply cost, every repair cost. But this one fee hasn't changed, which is strange because that particular pasture access is probably worth more now than it was 4 years ago. His brow had the particular furrow of a child engaged in something that interested him against his will. Why? Because of the drought the last 2 summers. Reliable water access is worth more when water is scarce. She looked up at him. Someone's being unusually generous. He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's Crow's land. The south pasture access goes through his property." She hadn't known that. "How do you know that?" "I heard Dad talking to Gus." He said it without apology, the simple directness of a child who listened to things and didn't pretend otherwise. She looked at the ledger, looked at that number, thought about patience that ends and what it ends into. "Go back to sleep," she said, "or you'll be exhausted by noon." "I don't sleep much anymore." He said it like a fact, not a complaint. She looked at him. "I know." She closed the ledger. "Does warm milk actually help you, or is that just what adults say?" He almost smiled. It was the barest motion, like something considering coming to the surface and not quite making it. "I don't know. Nobody's asked before." "There's milk in the cold box." She stood. "Want to find out?" He stood on the other side of the table and considered her for a moment with those careful eyes that held more than any child's eyes should have had to hold. "Okay," said Owen Mercer. She warmed the milk. The warm milk worked, that first time and most times after. It became a quiet ritual between them. Not every night, but often enough that Owen started coming to the kitchen when he couldn't sleep without having to decide whether to. He'd sit on the stool at the end of the work table, and Savannah would put the small pan on the stove, and they'd talk or not talk depending on how the night felt. She never pushed for more words than he had available. She'd learned early that the way to ruin something fragile was to grab at it. By the end of January, Owen was talking to her in full sentences. By the first week of February, the month that had taken his mother, the month that still sat heavy in the house like furniture nobody moved, he was asking her questions about the accounts, about the ranch, about what she thought Crow was actually after, which was a question more pointed than most adults would have asked. And she answered it honestly because she decided early on that he was a boy who needed honest answers more than he needed protection from them. Luke, for his part, had never required coaxing. Luke operated at 1 volume and 1 speed, and with a faith in the goodwill of strangers that should have been alarming but was mostly just Luke. He decided Savannah was good people somewhere around day 2, and after that she was simply part of the landscape. Someone who fixed things and made food, and occasionally helped him with the letters he still mixed up on the page. She'd noticed the way certain words gave him trouble, the way he'd squint at a line and then give up, and she'd started working with him in the evenings after supper, patient and matter-of-fact about it, treating it like a practical problem with a practical solution rather than something to be worried over. Rhett had watched that without comment for about a week before he came into the kitchen one evening while she was going over the alphabet with Luke, and stood in the doorway longer than he needed to. "He's been that way since he started school," he said later, after Luke had gone up. "They told me he was slow. He's not slow." She was washing the cups from supper. "He sees letters differently than most people. There's a name for it. I've read about it. It doesn't have anything to do with how smart he is." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "You've read about it." I read a lot of things. She set a cup on the rack. He needs different methods, not less effort. He's actually trying harder than any of the other children probably are, because everything takes him more work. She heard him behind her, the particular silence of someone processing something they hadn't expected to hear. Nobody told me that. Nobody who taught him probably knew it. She turned around. But he's going to be fine. He just needs someone to work with him without making him feel like there's something wrong with him. Rhett looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, plain and without ceremony, which was, she'd learned how he said things he meant. February came anyway, the way hard months always do, without announcement, without any quality of being ready. The anniversary of Clara Mercer's death landed on a Thursday, and the house felt it the way a body feels a change in the weather before the clouds arrive. Rhett went out early and came in late and said very little in between. Gus didn't come in for supper, just took his plate to the outbuilding. Luke was louder than usual, which she'd started to understand was his version of the same thing Owen expressed in silence. Owen didn't come downstairs at all until past noon. She found him sitting on the porch in the cold, which was the kind of decision that made no practical sense, and every emotional one. He had his mother's photograph in his hands. She'd seen him take it from the mantel, and he was just looking at it. She brought him his coat. She didn't say anything about going inside. She sat down in the other chair. After a while, he said, "She would have liked you." Savannah wasn't sure what to do with that. It landed somewhere it hadn't been looking to land. "Tell me something about her," she said. He looked at the photograph. "She burned everything she cooked, every single thing. Dad used to say she could burn water." The corner of his mouth moved. She used to laugh about it. She'd put the food on the table and say, "Well, I tried," and then we'd all eat it anyway, because it wasn't that bad most of the time. "That's a good quality," Savannah said, "knowing when to laugh at yourself." "She made the quilt on your bed." He said it without looking at her. "She made a lot of things. She used to say the hands should always be doing something." Savannah had been sleeping under that quilt for 6 weeks and hadn't known. She thought about that, about hands that had cut and sewn and made something that was still in use, still keeping someone warm well after the hands themselves were gone. She didn't say anything about it. She just sat there with him in the cold until he was ready to go inside. The trouble with the ranch had a different quality after February. It was as if Crow had taken note of some internal calendar, as if the anniversary of Clara's death was the moment he'd decided the Mercers would be at their most vulnerable, and had chosen to apply pressure accordingly. The first sabotage Savannah could directly trace was in early March. 3 sections of the east fence had been cut, cleanly, with wire cutters during the night. Not broken, cut. The distinction mattered. Broken could be weather, could be age. Cut meant intent. Rhett found it at dawn and came back to the house with the expression she'd started to associate with news he didn't want to bring inside. He told her what he'd found, and she listened, and then she said, "Who has access to that pasture road?" "In theory? Anyone who uses the county road? In practice?" He looked at her. "There's a hand who worked for me until October. Name's Harlan Briggs. I let him go because I couldn't pay what he was worth. He took work with Crow's operation shortly after." "Has he been on the property?" "Not that I've seen." "Who would have seen, if not you?" He was quiet. Then, "Gus rides that line on Tuesdays." She talked to Gus that afternoon. Gus was not a man who gave information up easily. He had the particular economy of someone who believed most questions didn't deserve answers. But when she framed it as a practical problem rather than a social one, he engaged. He had seen a rider on the county road last week. Couldn't say who from the distance. Dark horse, he thought. Crow's hands rode dark horses. It wasn't proof. She wrote it down anyway. By mid-March, 2 more of their remaining hands had quit, both within the same week, both citing better opportunities. Neither would say where. Rhett found out through Gus that both men had been seen at the Crow property the week before they quit. Again, not illegal, not provable, just the steady application of economic pressure on a man who was already stretched thin. She started keeping a record, not with any clear idea of what she'd do with it, just because she'd learned that the accumulation of small facts was sometimes the only tool available when large evidence was being carefully avoided. She also, quietly, started talking to people in town. This wasn't something she announced. She just paid attention to who came into the Laramie supply store when she went for provisions, who talked to who avoided certain conversations when certain names came up. She introduced herself plainly, without strategy. Savannah Hale, she was working for Rhett Mercer, out on the South Ranch. She asked questions that were practical and neighborly about suppliers and weather and the spring planting, and she listened to what came back. What came back mostly was an education in how thoroughly Silas Crow had made himself the center of economic gravity in the county. He had controlling interest in the mill, a partnership with the bank that held most of the local agricultural loans, and a supply contract with the County Road Commission. That last one was particularly elegant. It meant that anyone who depended on maintained road access had reason to stay on his good side, which was nearly everyone. She met a woman named Dot Calloway at the dry goods store in late March. Dot was in her early 50s, solid as a fence post, with the blunt manner of someone who'd been a widow long enough to stop worrying about being agreeable. She'd had her own trouble with Crow 3 years prior, a dispute over land access on her eastern border, and had come out of it with the particular knowledge of someone who'd fought and not entirely lost. "You're the Mercer woman," Dot said, which wasn't quite accurate, but close enough that Savannah didn't correct it. "Savannah Hale, I'm working for Mr. Mercer." "Same thing to Crow," Dot said. "You being there makes it personal for him. He doesn't like it when people don't fold." Savannah bought her dry goods and thought about that on the ride back. She wasn't sure if Dot meant Rhett or herself or both. The meeting with Thomas Birch at the Laramie Land Office happened by accident, or something that resembled accident. She'd gone to inquire about water access records, the specific paperwork on the South Pasture route she'd noticed in Rhett's accounts. And Birch was the clerk who pulled the file. He was young for the position, cautious in the way of someone still learning where the edges of his authority were. He showed her the relevant documents. She read them carefully, and she noticed something that made her ask him to go back to a specific page. "This amendment," she said, "this addendum to the original water rights agreement, when was it filed?" Birch checked. 18 months ago. And the original agreement is from 1879, so about 6 years. She looked at the amendment. It wasn't large, a single paragraph, but it changed the terms of the access agreement in a way that was subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking for it. The original agreement granted the Mercers access rights to the Southern Water Route in perpetuity. The amendment added a clause about active use requirements, specifically that the access rights could be voided if the property fell into foreclosure or changed hands. "Did Mr. Mercer sign this amendment?" she asked. Birch looked at the page, looked more carefully. "There's a signature here." "Is it his?" A longer pause. "I can't verify that from what's in the file." She asked for a copy of both the original and the amendment. Birch hesitated. It was public record. He had no reason to refuse, but he hesitated in the way of someone who had been taught to be careful about certain requests. She waited him out with the specific patience of someone who had nowhere more important to be and knew it. He made the copies. She took them back to the ranch and spread them on the kitchen table that evening. Rhett looked at them for a long time without speaking. His expression went through several changes that she tracked and didn't comment on. "I didn't sign this," he said finally. "I know." He looked up. "How do you know?" She pointed to the signature. "You write your name with the R first, then a long loop to the H. This is flat. Whoever signed this has different handwriting." He stared at it. "This was filed a year and a half ago, when Clara was sick." He said it with the specific flatness of someone naming a fact they have to say out loud before they can process it. "I was barely off this property." "Which means someone had access to your name and a clerk somewhere who was willing to file without verifying." She sat down. "It also means there's an argument that your water rights aren't protected the way they should be, which is what Crow needs if the bank pushes foreclosure." "The bank?" He was quiet for a moment. "The bank that has a partnership arrangement with Crow." "Yes." He sat down heavily. He put both hands flat on the table. "Savannah, if this amendment stands and the bank calls the loan, it doesn't have to stand." She'd been thinking about it since the land office. A fraudulent filing can be challenged. You'd need a lawyer, you'd need the original documents, and you'd need to move before anything goes further with the bank. But it can be challenged. A lawyer costs money I don't have. Dot Calloway mentioned a man in Cheyenne. Ezra Finch. He's handled Crow disputes before, and he works on contingency for cases he thinks have merit. Rhett looked at her. You talked to Dot Calloway. I talked to a lot of people. She kept her voice practical. Is that a problem? He was quiet for a longer moment than the question required. No, he said. It isn't. And the way he said it had something in it she couldn't quite place. Not quite surprise, something closer to recalibration. Like he was adjusting an estimate he'd made and finding the new number more than he'd expected. The letter to Ezra Finch went out in the first week of April. She wrote it herself, at Rhett's request, because he said she explained things more clearly on paper than he did. She laid out the facts in plain language: the original agreement, the filed amendment, the forged signature, the timeline. She attached the copies from the land office. She made the argument for merit without overstating it, which she thought was important. A lawyer worth his contingency fee would see through enthusiasm. She didn't tell Rhett she'd also written a second letter to the Wyoming Land Registry in Cheyenne, flagging the filing irregularity for administrative review. It wasn't the same as legal action, but it was one more piece of sand in the machinery, and she'd concluded that sand in the machinery was what the situation required. The ranch continued to need running while all of this was in motion. That was the thing about crisis. It didn't pause the daily work. The horses needed feeding, and the fences that were still standing needed maintenance, and the accounts needed tending, and Luke needed his evening reading practice, and Owen needed his quiet kitchen nights, and Gus needed to be convinced periodically that eating actual meals was worth his time. She was in the middle of all of it one April evening, 3 months after arriving, when she stopped in the middle of setting the table for supper and became aware of something she couldn't immediately explain. It was the specific quality of the house around her. The sound of Luke arguing with Owen upstairs about something that didn't matter. The smell of the stew on the stove. Gus's boots on the porch boards. Rhett's horse coming into the yard at the end of the day. She'd been managing a crisis. That was how she'd been thinking of it. That was how she'd framed her presence here in her own mind. Temporary, purposeful, defined by the problem that needed solving. But standing in that kitchen in April, she became aware that something had shifted without her noticing it shift. This felt like somewhere she lived. She put that thought down carefully, the way you put down something you're not sure is safe to carry. It wasn't part of the arrangement. The arrangement was until spring, and spring was already here. She set the last bowl on the table and went back to the stove. Rhett came through the door, hung up his coat, washed his hands at the basin. The boys came down from upstairs in the specific avalanche of noise that characterized their descent. Gus came in from the porch. They sat down. Ezra Finch wrote back, Rhett said, once they'd all settled. He said it to Savannah, across the table. She looked up. And? He's coming up from Cheyenne next week. Rhett picked up his spoon. He says the case has merit. Luke looked between them with the wide-eyed attention of a child who understands that something important is being said even if the exact meaning is above him. Owen was watching his father's face, and then Savannah's with that careful, measuring quality he brought to everything. Good, she said. Yeah. Rhett held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Good. Gus ate his stew. Outside the kitchen window, the April sky had gone a pale, clear blue that was almost startling after the gray weight of winter, and the last of the snow along the fence lines had thinned to dirty white scraps that would be gone in another week. The ranch was still in danger. The letter to the land registry might accomplish nothing. Crow hadn't made his next move yet, which meant it was still coming. She knew all of that. She ate her supper and listened to Luke trying to get Owen to agree to something Owen clearly had no intention of agreeing to. And the stew was not as good as it could have been because she'd let it go a little long while writing the second letter. And Gus asked for more bread in the tone of a man who would never directly compliment a meal, but found ways to indicate approval. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't resolved, but it was real, and it was hers for now, and she let herself have it. Ezra Finch arrived on a Tuesday, which turned out to be the same day the bank sent its letter. Savannah was the one who brought in the mail from the postbox at the end of the road, a habit she'd fallen into without deciding to, and she stood in the yard with the envelope in her hand and read the return address twice before going inside. She set it on the kitchen table. She didn't open it. It was addressed to Rhett, but she didn't need to. The letterhead of the Laramie Territorial Bank had the specific quality of bad news that announces itself through the envelope. Rhett read it standing at the table, still in his coat. Finch was due in 2 hours. The letter informed Rhett that his outstanding loan balance was being called for full review, that an assessor would be visiting the property within 30 days, and that based on current valuations, the bank was considering its options. The language was careful and bloodless in the way that lawyers write when they want to threaten without technically threatening. 30 days, Rhett said, which is not an accident. Savannah looked at the letter over his arm. Finch gets here today. The bank moves today. Crow knows about Finch. Rhett folded the letter. Small county. Very small. He put the letter in his jacket pocket. He went back out to finish the morning work because the work didn't stop for bank letters or land barons or any of the other things bearing down on this property, and she watched him cross the yard toward the barn with the particular gait of a man carrying more weight than was visible and refusing to adjust his stride for it. Ezra Finch was not what she'd pictured. She'd imagined someone imposing, the kind of lawyer who wore his profession like armor. Finch was a small man in his late 40s with a neat gray beard and ink-stained fingers and the mild expression of someone who had heard a great many terrible things and had learned to receive them without flinching. He came in a hired buggy from town with a leather case that was soft from years of use, and he shook Rhett's hand and then Savannah's and said, "You wrote the letter," to her in a tone that was an acknowledgement rather than a question. "I did," she said. "It was a good letter." He set his case on the table. "Clear. You didn't editorialize." I was tempted. He almost smiled. Most people are. They sat at the kitchen table, Rhett, Savannah, Finch, and went through the documents for nearly 2 hours. Finch had reviewed the copies she'd sent and had done his own research on the land registry filing. He confirmed what she'd suspected. The amendment signature was inconsistent with Rhett's other recorded signatures in county documents. He'd found 2 other instances, a grazing lease and a fence line agreement, where Rhett's name appeared on filings he didn't recall making. "He's been building this for longer than you knew," Finch said. Rhett had his hands flat on the table in the way he had when he was keeping himself still by will. "How long?" "Probably from when your wife became ill, possibly before." Finch said it without apology, which Savannah respected. False gentleness around hard facts helped nobody. He would have known that a man managing a sick spouse and a failing ranch and 2 children is a man who isn't watching the land registry. He was right, Rhett said. He was. But he made mistakes. Finch opened his case and produced a paper. The 3rd signature, the fence line agreement, was notarized, and the notary whose stamp is on it retired 18 months ago, which means either he came out of retirement to notarize a document or someone used his stamp without him. Savannah looked at the paper. "Can you find him?" "Already did." Finch folded his hands. "He's living in Rawlins. He has no memory of this document. He is also, it turns out, very interested in the fact that his stamp appears to have been used after his retirement. Retired notaries tend to take that personally." Rhett exhaled, slow. It wasn't relief. Too much was still wrong for relief. But it was the sound of a man who had been bracing for one more piece of bad news and had received something different. "The bank letter complicates things," Savannah said. Finch nodded. "It does. 30 days is tight. I can file an emergency injunction to freeze the water rights dispute while the forgery claim is under review, but that requires a cooperative judge, and Crow has relationships in this county's court." "There's a circuit judge out of Cheyenne," she said. "Comes through every other month. When is he next due?" Finch looked at her. "You know the circuit schedule?" "I looked it up after I sent the second letter." She said it without particular pride. "Judge Alderman. He has a reputation for not being interested in local politics." A beat of silence. Finch picked up his pen and wrote something down. "Alderman's next circuit is 3 weeks from Thursday. That's tight, but workable if I file in Cheyenne directly rather than here." "File in Cheyenne," Rhett said. Finch nodded. He began reorganizing his papers, and Savannah watched the way he moved. Efficient, unhurried, with the quality of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and knew that panic was a luxury. She found she trusted him, which was not something she extended quickly. "There's one more thing," Finch said, closing his case. "Crow is going to escalate. Filing in Cheyenne, challenging the amendment, he'll know within days. Whatever he's been holding back, He won't hold it back after this. Rhett was quiet for a moment. I know. Make sure your people know it too, Maasem. Rhett left 2 days later for a meeting with a ranching cooperative 3 counties east, a potential partnership arrangement that Savannah had been researching and had brought to him in March. A group of smaller operations pooling resources to negotiate better supply rates and share equipment costs. It was exactly the kind of arrangement that could shift the financial footing of the Mercer Ranch without requiring Crow's water access, which was the point. He didn't want to go with everything that was in motion, but she told him to go, that she and Gus had the ranch, and that the meeting was as important as anything Finch was doing. He stood in the yard the morning he left with his travel bag over his shoulder, and he looked at her with that expression she'd been noticing more and more, the one she didn't have a clean category for. You sure? He said. I've been sure of harder things than this. She crossed her arms against the morning chill. Go make the case. You're good at it when you don't talk yourself out of it first. He held her gaze for a moment. I do that. You do. She said it without meanness. Stop. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close to one. The kind that came and went before it fully landed. He got on his horse and rode down the track toward the road, and she stood in the yard until he was out of sight, which she hadn't meant to do but did anyway. The boys were restless without their father. Luke channeled it into noise and motion, following Gus around the yard like a shadow, and narrating everything Gus did in a running commentary that Gus endured with the specific stoicism of a man who had long ago made peace with things he couldn't change. Owen was quieter than usual, which was saying something, and he spent most of the first day on the porch with a book he wasn't really reading. She let them both be and got on with the work. The second evening, she was in the kitchen after supper when Owen came and sat at the table without being asked. He'd been doing this reliably for months now. The late kitchen visits had become their way, his and hers, and she'd come to value them in a way she hadn't anticipated when they started. Do you think Crow will do something while Dad's gone? He asked. She was washing the supper dishes. She thought about the right answer and decided the honest one. I think it's possible. Gus knows to keep an eye on the fence lines. Owen was quiet for a moment. Gus is old. Gus is also the toughest man I've ever met, and I grew up around some tough people. She set a plate on the rack. He'll be fine. What if it's not the fence lines? Owen said. She turned around and looked at him. He was watching her with that quality he had, the one that was beyond his years in the specific way of children who'd had to understand things they shouldn't have had to understand yet. What are you thinking? She asked. Dad talked to Gus about it before he left. I heard them. He said it straightforwardly, no apology for listening, which was just Owen. Gus said Crow's men have been seen on the county road at night, past the property, back toward the creek, 3 separate times in the last 2 weeks. She dried her hands. Why didn't Gus tell me this? He probably figured Dad told you. She made a note to have a direct conversation with Gus about the assumption that information passed through people correctly. She sat down across from Owen. The creek feeds the South Water access? The main one, yes. He looked at the table. If something happened to the creek diversion, we'd lose the water pressure in the upper pasture, the horses. He'd been thinking about this, working through it the same way she worked through things, not with panic, but with the patient application of attention to what was actually there. She looked at him, this 10-year-old boy with his mother's careful hands and his father's set jaw, and felt something she'd been trying to keep at a manageable distance. I'll talk to Gus tonight, she said, and we'll check the diversion in the morning, okay? He nodded. Then, after a pause, You're not scared. I didn't say that. You don't look it. Looking scared doesn't help anything. She stood, went back to the dishes. Being careful does. There's a difference. He thought about that. Mom used to say something like that. She kept her hands in the wash water and didn't turn around because she didn't entirely trust her face at that moment. She sounds like she was smart. She was. A pause. You're smart too. Different, but smart. She finished the last dish. Go to bed, Owen. I know, he said, and went. Oh, she talked to Gus. Gus confirmed what Owen had overheard, with the additional detail that one of the sightings had been close enough for him to recognize a horse, a gray roan that belonged, as far as he knew, to a man named Deckard, who rode for Crow's operation. Why didn't you come to me directly? She asked him. Gus looked at her in the way of a man who had been managing his own business for 50 years and wasn't sure the question made complete sense. Figured Rhett knew. Rhett's not here. No, Gus said. He isn't. And the way he said it had something in it that was almost apology, which from Gus was significant. They set a watch schedule. Gus would take the early night hours. She'd take the later ones. It was not ideal. She was not a ranch hand, and the cold at 2 a.m. in April was still serious, but the alternatives were worse. The first 2 nights were quiet. She sat on the porch in her coat with Rhett's old field lantern turned low, and she watched the dark beyond the fence and listened to the sounds of the ranch at night, which were many and unfamiliar and gradually became less so. She learned the difference between the horses moving normally in the barn and the horses moving because something had disturbed them. She learned the sounds the wind made through the gap in the north outbuilding versus the sound a person made moving through dry grass. On the 3rd night, she heard the second kind. It came from the direction of the barn, not the fence line. She stood up from the chair and stood still for a moment, listening. The horses had shifted, not panicked, but alert. The particular quality of animals that had registered something wrong without identifying it yet. She took the lantern and walked toward the barn. The door was the way she'd left it, latched from outside. She unlatched it and opened it, and the smell hit her before she saw anything. Wrong, acrid, not the usual smells of horses and hay and old wood. She lifted the lantern, the back corner of the barn, something orange in the straw. She didn't stop to think about it in any organized way. She turned and ran for the house, and she was up the porch steps and through the door, and shouting before her mind had fully assembled what she was going to say. Gus, fire, barn. She heard him hit the floor of the outbuilding, and she was already back outside, already moving toward the barn, because there were 8 horses in there, and the fire was still small, and there was a window of time that was closing. Gus came out of the outbuilding at a run with a blanket and a bucket he'd grabbed on instinct, which told her everything about how long he'd been doing this work. She got the barn door open wide, and the smoke was worse now, thicker, the corner fire having found purchase in the wall behind the straw, and the horses were fully alarmed, the sound of them enormous in the space, hooves and breath, and the high, sharp noise of panic. I'll get the front stalls, she said to Gus. You take the back. The back's where the fire. I know where the fire is. She handed him the lantern and went into the smoke. It was not heroic. It was terrible. The smoke hit her like a wall and her eyes began pouring, and she moved by feel along the stall fronts, unlatching each one, talking to the horses in the low, steady, nonsense way she'd seen Rhett do it. Not the words, the tone, the pitch, something that said, I know, move now, I know, and pushing them toward the door with her hands and her body and whatever authority she could project through the fear. 4 of the front stalls. Then 3. She lost her sense of the smoke for a moment, lost her direction, and a horse she was trying to move caught her with a shoulder and sent her into the stall partition hard enough that she felt it in her back and her head. She stayed down for a beat. 2 beats. The smoke was lower near the ground, which she knew, which was the only useful thing she could think. Savannah, Gus's voice from the direction of the door. I'm here. She got up. I'm coming. She came out through the barn door coughing so hard she couldn't stand upright, and the night air hit her like cold water, and she bent over with her hands on her knees and breathed and coughed and breathed again. Gus had the horses in the yard. Most of them, not all, 3 still to account for. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something like fear which she wouldn't have said was possible from him. 3 more, she got out. I'll go. They're in the back 2 stalls. She straightened. The fire's in the corner behind them. It hasn't reached the stalls yet, but it will. They need to come out the side door. Gus went back in. She went to the water trough and put her face in it, which helped her eyes. And then she went to the side of the barn where the second door was and got it open and stood there as Gus brought the last 3 out one at a time, which felt like it took an hour and was probably 3 minutes. The fire was not going to take the barn. It was going to take the corner section, the wall, some of the stored equipment. But Gus had gotten a line of buckets going from the water pump, and the structure itself was stone foundation and heavy timber, and what was burning down rather than spreading up, and they contained it by the time the sky had started to change in the east. She sat in the dirt of the yard when it was done, because she couldn't stand anymore, and she became aware that her arm had been burned at some point. Not badly, not the kind that required immediate terror, but a burn, a real one, that had been sending signals she'd been ignoring for the last hour, and that her back, from the partition impact, was going to be spectacular in the morning. She was aware of all this in a distant way, because what was closer was the sound of the horses breathing in the yard around her. 8 horses alive and injured in none of the important ways, and the barn still standing behind its smoke, and Gus sitting on a fence post with his head down, exhausted and entire. She heard feet on the porch. Light feet, running. Owen hit the yard at a dead run, and he didn't slow down and he didn't stop. He ran straight to her and dropped to his knees in the dirt beside her, and put his arms around her with a force that surprised her. Not a careful hug, not a polite one, but the kind of grip that a person uses when they have been genuinely afraid. And he pressed his face against her shoulder and said something she almost didn't catch. She went very still. He said it again, muffled against her coat, and this time she heard it. Mom. Not a question, not an accident. He said it the way you say a word you have been thinking for a long time and have finally decided to let out. She put her arms around him and didn't say anything at all, because there was nothing she could have said that would have been right, and some moments needed to be exactly what they were without anyone trying to improve them. Luke appeared on the porch, saw them in the yard, and came down the steps more slowly. He looked at the smoke still rising from the barn corner, at the horses, at Savannah and Owen in the dirt. He sat down on Savannah's other side without a word and leaned against her shoulder with all his weight, which was more than she'd expected, and she shifted to accommodate it. Gus looked at the 3 of them from his fence post. He looked for a long time. Then he looked away, back at the horses, and said nothing, which from Gus was a kind of permission. The sky in the east had gone from black to the deep blue that came before anything else. The color that wasn't night and wasn't morning, and the yard smelled of smoke and cold air, and the particular sharp smell of scared horses calming down. And Savannah sat in the dirt with Owen holding on to her and Luke's weight against her side, and she understood, in a way she hadn't let herself understand before, that the arrangement that was supposed to last until spring had become something that had no logical end date, and that she was not, if she was honest, sorry about it. Gus came down from the fence post eventually and stood in front of them. He looked at Savannah's arm. That needs dressing, he said. I know. Now, not later. In a minute. He made the sound of a man who understood this was the best he was going to get and went to see about the horses. Owen's grip on her had loosened but not released. She could feel him breathing, steadier now, the panic run of his heart slowing down. He hadn't said anything else since the word that had come out of him in the dark, and she didn't expect him to. She understood Owen well enough by now to know that he'd said the thing that needed saying and that the rest would come when it came. She looked up at the sky, which was becoming slowly and inexorably lighter, and thought about Rhett coming home to a scorched barn corner and 3 horses that had to be kept in the yard for the night and a woman who'd walked into a fire. She thought about what Finch had said. Whatever he's been holding back, he won't hold it back after this. They'd set fire to the barn while Rhett was away, while the ranch was at its most exposed. And it had almost worked. Not the fire itself. The fire had been meant to take the barn, take the horses, take the last viable argument that this was a functioning operation, and it hadn't worked. But it had come close enough to serve as a message. The message was, next time we finish it, She looked at the barn, at the blackened corner still exhaling thin smoke into the early morning, and felt something harden in her chest that was not fear and not anger exactly, but something that lived in the neighborhood of both. All right, she thought. All right then. Rhett came home to smoke. He'd pushed the horse hard from the last relay station, arriving before noon, and Savannah knew he'd known something was wrong before he crested the ridge, because he came down the track at a pace that wasn't his usual. She was on the porch when he rode in, her burned arm wrapped, and her back stiff enough that sitting down and getting up required a specific sequence of movements she'd worked out through trial and error that morning. He took in the barn first, the blackened corner, the patched section of wall that Gus had already begun boarding over, the horses still in the yard because she hadn't wanted to put them back inside until the smoke smell had cleared. Then he took in her arm, then her face. He dismounted without tying the horse, which told her where his head was. How bad? He said. The barn took the corner section, Equipment loss, some stored feed, the structure held. She kept her voice level. All 8 horses are fine. He looked at her arm again. I'm asking about you. The arm is a burn. 2nd degree on a small section. Gus dressed it. She shifted her weight. My back got acquainted with a stall partition. It'll sort itself. He stood in front of her and he looked at her the way he sometimes did. That honest, direct look that didn't try to soften what it was doing. And she held it. You went in, he said. The horses were inside. Savannah. They were inside, Rhett. She said it plainly. What would you have done? He didn't answer that, which was its own answer. He reached out and very carefully took her wrapped arm by the wrist, not the burn, just the wrist, and looked at the dressing with the expression of a man inspecting something that he can't fix after the fact and knows it. He let go, ran his hand over his face. I should have been here. You should have been at that meeting, which you were, which was the right decision. She moved to let him pass to the door. Come inside. I'll tell you all of it. She told him everything, in order, at the kitchen table, the watch schedule she and Gus had set, the 3 nights, what she'd heard, what she'd seen, how it had gone. Owen and Luke were at the table too. She hadn't made them leave because they'd been there, they knew what had happened, and she'd decided a long time ago that keeping children ignorant of things they'd already witnessed was more insulting than useful. Rhett listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything important. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Deckard, he said. The Grey Roan. That's what Gus said. Deckard's been with Crow 4 years. He's not going to talk. He looked at the table. But someone set that fire and someone has to know about it. Someone does know about it, she said. The question is whether they'll say so. Owen across the table had been tracking the conversation with those careful eyes. Harlan Briggs would know, he said. Everyone looked at him. He looked back, steady. Harlan was Dad's hand, he said, explaining to Savannah rather than his father. He knows everything about this property, the water access, the barn layout, the watch schedule Dad used to keep. If Crow's people planned this, they would have asked Harlan. Rhett was quiet in a way that meant he'd already thought of this and didn't like where it went. Harlan's working for Crow now. Harlan didn't want to leave, Owen said. You said you couldn't pay him enough. That's different from wanting to go. The table was quiet. Luke, who had been unusually still for the last hour, pulled at a loose thread on his sleeve. Savannah looked at Rhett. Is that true? He didn't want to leave? Rhett exhaled. He asked if there was another way. I didn't have one to give him. A pause. I should talk to him. Carefully, Finch had said, and she repeated it now. Carefully. If Crow finds out you're talking to Harlan before Finch has filed, I know. He stood up. I'll be careful. She believed him and was also aware that careful men sometimes stopped being careful when they were angry, and Rhett had the specific controlled anger of someone who had been managing it for months and had just come home to a scorched barn and a woman with a burned arm. Tomorrow, she said. Not today. Today you're not in the right place for careful. He looked at her. She held it. Tomorrow, he agreed. The barn rebuild started the next morning. This was not something Savannah had organized. It organized itself, which was the thing that surprised her most about it. Dot Calloway showed up before 8 with her hired man and 2 loads of lumber in a flatbed. Behind her, a rancher named Cal Pruitt, whom Savannah had spoken to exactly once at the supply store, arrived with 3 of his hands and enough nails to build 2 barns. By mid-morning, there were 11 people working on the Mercer property. None of them asked, all of them there. She stood in the yard and watched this happen and didn't know what to do with it, which was unusual for her. Dot appeared at her elbow. Close your mouth, she said not unkindly. I didn't ask anyone to come. No. Dot looked at the work going on. Word got around about the fire. People around here aren't blind, they're scared. There's a difference. What happened to your barn? That's the kind of thing that reminds people they've been scared too long. She shrugged, practical about it. Besides, everyone liked Clara. Doing something for Rhett's place feels like doing something for her. Savannah looked at the activity in her yard. Strangers rebuilding a structure that a powerful man had tried to destroy, and understood that this was not a small thing and that she needed to be useful rather than moved by it. She went and made food. It was what she could do. She made enough for everyone and kept it coming, And when people took breaks, they came to the porch and ate, and she learned their names and what they grew and who their families were, because that was how you built something that lasted. Not the barn, though the barn too, but the other thing, the less visible structure that held communities together when the visible ones were under attack. Rhett worked alongside Pruitt's hands all day, and she watched him through the kitchen window at intervals. The way he moved among these people, easy and real, without the strain of the last months in his shoulders. He was good at this. He was better with people than he gave himself credit for. Harlan Briggs came in the afternoon. She saw him from the porch before Rhett did. A heavy-set man in his 40s, worn hat, the walk of someone who had decided to do something and was getting it done before he changed his mind. He stopped at the edge of the yard and stood there until Rhett noticed him. She watched them from the porch. She couldn't hear what was said. The conversation was short, 10 minutes maybe, and she watched Rhett's body language go from closed to something else, something more complicated. When Harlan left, Rhett stood alone in the yard for a moment, then came toward the porch. "He didn't set the fire," Rhett said. "He knew it was coming. Deckard talked, but he didn't do it." He came up the steps. "He'll make a statement to Finch." She kept her voice steady. "What changed his mind?" Rhett looked at her. "He said he heard what you did, going into the barn." A pause. "He said he couldn't keep quiet after that." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She handed him a cup of coffee, which he took, and they stood on the porch in the afternoon light and watched the barn going back up, board by board. Finch filed in Cheyenne that same week. The forgery claim, the fraudulent amendment, and, based on Harlan's statement, taken by Finch himself at the Laramie Hotel with 2 witnesses, a formal complaint of arson and criminal intimidation against parties associated with the Crow operation. He named Deckard directly. He named Crow by implication, with enough documentation attached to make implication uncomfortable. The county inspection was scheduled for the following Thursday. This had been Crow's mechanism, a routine property assessment that, under normal circumstances, would have been an excuse to find violations and build a case for the bank's foreclosure review. Savannah had known about it from Finch and had spent the preceding 2 weeks making sure there was nothing on the Mercer property that could be legitimately cited. She went over every structure. She documented the water access system with written measurements and a rough diagram. She pulled together 4 years of maintenance records, the purchase receipts she'd been organizing since January, the pasture rotation logs that Gus kept in a battered notebook nobody had thought to preserve before. She created a clear record of a functioning, maintained, legitimately operated ranch. She also, because she had learned not to trust that things would go correctly on their own, wrote to Judge Alderman's circuit clerk and noted that an inspection of the Mercer property was scheduled, and that there was an active forgery claim pending in Cheyenne that bore directly on the property's legal standing, and that she hoped the inspection record would be preserved with appropriate care given the circumstances. It was not subtle. She hadn't intended it to be. The inspectors arrived Thursday morning, 2 men from the county assessor's office, both of whom she'd never seen before. She met them at the gate with the property record she'd assembled and a straightforward explanation of what it contained. She was not hostile. She was not nervous. She was the kind of organized and prepared that made it clear that whatever they'd been told to expect, this was not it. Rhett showed them the property. She walked with them for part of it, answering questions about the water access records with the specific, detailed accuracy of someone who had spent a month understanding the subject. Gus showed them the equipment and fencing with the particular economy of a man who knew exactly what he'd built and maintained and wasn't going to apologize for any of it. The older of the 2 inspectors, a man named Howell, with the careful expression of someone doing a job he understood had dimensions beyond the job, stopped at the repaired barn and looked at the new lumber. "This was recently damaged," he said. "Arson," Savannah said. "There is a formal complaint filed in Cheyenne. The structure has been repaired by volunteers from the surrounding community." Howell wrote something down. He looked at the yard, at the evidence of the community that had come. The new lumber, the quality of the work, the kind of repair that required more hands than any single family could provide. "The community came out for this," he said. "Yes," she said. "They did." He wrote something else. The inspection took 3 hours. At the end of it, Howell stood at the gate with his papers and said to Rhett, in a tone that was professional but carried something underneath it. The record here is in better order than most properties I assess. I'll note that in my report. Rhett thanked him. She thanked him. They watched the inspectors ride back down the track toward town. Rhett turned to her when they were out of sight. You wrote to the circuit clerk. I did. Before the inspection. Yes? He looked at her for a long moment. That was smart, he said. I know. She turned toward the house. I made a note of it so we'd remember the approach. He caught up to her in 2 strides, and she heard him laughing, which was a sound she hadn't heard often enough. Low and real, surprised out of him. You made a note of it. I make notes of everything. You should try it. He was still almost laughing when they reached the porch, and she felt it in the side of her chest like weather coming. Finch's injunction was granted by Judge Alderman 11 days after it was filed. The water rights dispute was frozen, pending resolution of the forgery claim, which meant Crow could not legally use the fraudulent amendment to accelerate foreclosure. The bank, whose partnership with Crow Finch had made sure to note in his filing documents, created a potential conflict of interest in its review of the Mercer loan. Went quiet with a speed that suggested institutional caution. Crow's response was to deny everything, which nobody was surprised by, and to retain a lawyer of his own, which Finch had also anticipated. But the ground had shifted. The evidence was in a Cheyenne courtroom now, out of county jurisdiction, under a judge who had no reason to return favors to anyone in Laramie. Deckard had been identified in a formal complaint. Harlan's statement was on record. The retired notary in Rawlins had given a written account of his stamp's unauthorized use. None of it was finished. Finch was careful to say that clearly. This was not over. This was a change in position. This would take time. Courts were slow and Crow had money for delays. But the momentum had reversed. Savannah could feel it the way you feel a wind change. Not in any single thing, but in the quality of the air. Dot Calloway came by on a Saturday afternoon in late April with a jar of something she'd put up from last summer's harvest and a look of satisfaction that she didn't bother to hide. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and said, Crow went to the Laramie Bank this week to renegotiate his own terms with them. That's a man who's worried about his position. Where did you hear that? Savannah asked. I hear things. Dot drank her coffee. So do you. Which is half the reason Crow can't get his feet under him. He's used to people staying quiet. You didn't stay quiet, and now other people aren't either. Savannah thought about the second letter she'd sent to the land registry months ago, the one she hadn't told Rhett about until later. Small pieces of sand, she'd thought at the time. Sand that had accumulated. Rhett came in from outside while Dot was there, and Dot looked between the two of them with the unsubtle assessment of a woman who had lived long enough to read rooms accurately and no longer pretended she wasn't doing it. You're staying, Dot said to Savannah. Not a question. Savannah looked at her coffee cup. The arrangement was until spring. It's May, Dot said. I'm aware of that. Dot made a sound of profound patience, exhausted. She looked at Rhett. Rhett looked at the wall with the expression of a man who had something to say and had not yet worked out how to say it in company. I'll leave you two to that, Dot said, and took her coffee to the porch with the complete absence of subtlety of someone who had made a decision on others' behalf and was comfortable with it. The kitchen was quiet. Savannah didn't look up from her cup. Rhett sat down across from her. He put his hands on the table, not flat this time, just resting, and she was aware of them in the way she'd become aware of small things about him over months. The way his handwriting slanted left, the way he stood at the fence in the evening when the work was done, the way he laughed when something surprised it out of him. The arrangement, he said, was until spring. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want it to be now? She looked up. He was watching her with that honest, direct attention she'd come to rely on. No performance in it, no strategy. She thought about the depot in December, the cold platform and the blank notebook page and Margaret Aldridge's back door. She thought about Owen's voice in the dark. Mom. She thought about lying in the dirt of the yard with the smoke still rising from the barn and both boys leaning against her like she was something solid in a world that had been moving. I don't know how to do this simply, she said. I'm not built for simple. I know that. He didn't say it as a complaint. Neither am I. There's still Crow, the court case, the bank. None of that is resolved. No. And I don't want a position here, Rhett. I'm not looking for a roof over my head. That's not what this is. I know what it isn't, he said. She looked at him. What is it then? He held her gaze. I think you know what it is. She did know. That was the problem, and also not the problem. She'd known for a while, and she'd been careful with it the way you're careful with something you can't afford to break. And she wasn't sure careful was still the right approach. Outside on the porch, Dot Calloway was ostentatiously looking at the landscape with her back to the kitchen window. We should probably figure it out, Savannah said. Probably, Rhett agreed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not a decisive gesture, not a romantic one in the way of stories, just a hand on a hand. The simple fact of contact between two people who had been moving toward each other for months through a winter's worth of difficulty. His hand turned under hers and held it. Outside, the May afternoon was going gold at the edges, the way the light did out here when it was on its way to something better, and the barn stood new and solid against the sky, and somewhere on the property Luke was making more noise than one person should be capable of. And Owen's voice, quieter, steadier, was saying something back to him that made Luke laugh. It was not simple. It was not resolved. There was a court case and a land baron and months of hard work ahead, and she knew all of that as clearly as she knew anything. She kept her hand where it was. The hand-holding lasted about 40 seconds before Dot Calloway knocked on the kitchen window from the porch, not because she needed anything, but because she was Dot Calloway, and 40 seconds was apparently the limit of her patience for other people's moments. Savannah pulled her hand back and Rhett made a sound that was almost a laugh, and that was fine. That was actually fine. There would be time for the rest of it. First, there was still a fight to finish. Finch came back to Laramie in the second week of May, and he brought news that had the quality of a door opening rather than closing, which was not the same as the door being open, but it was movement, and movement was what they needed. The forgery case had been accepted for formal hearing in Cheyenne. Judge Alderman had reviewed the evidence package and agreed that the fraudulent amendment constituted a material legal issue that superseded the county bank's foreclosure review. In plain terms, the bank couldn't move on the loan while the amendment's validity was in question, and the amendment's validity was in very serious question. Additionally, the Wyoming Land Registry had completed its own administrative review of the irregularities Savannah had flagged in her second letter, the one she'd sent quietly, without announcement, back in the early spring. 3 filings connected to Crow properties had been flagged for inconsistency. The registry had referred the matter to the territory's attorney office. Finch laid all of this out at the kitchen table with his characteristic lack of drama, and when he finished, he folded his hands and said, I want to be direct. This is not a complete victory. Crow still has money, he still has lawyers, and cases like this can take years, but his position is significantly weaker than it was 3 months ago. What does significantly weaker look like? Rhett asked. It looks like the bank quietly reaching out to renegotiate your loan terms rather than pursue foreclosure, which I understand happened last week. Rhett looked at Savannah. She'd gotten that information from Dot and had been waiting for the right moment to raise it. It happened last week, she confirmed. Rhett absorbed that. They want to renegotiate. Because the legal terrain changed and they don't want to be named in a case about conflict of interest, Finch said. Banks are not loyal to anyone except their own position. Crow's position is weakening, so their alignment is shifting. He picked up his pen. I'd recommend negotiating the renegotiation from a position of patience rather than relief. You have more leverage than you think. After Finch left, Rhett sat at the table for a long time in the way he sometimes did when he was processing something that required space. She let him have it, doing other things in the kitchen, present without intruding. Finally, he said, You sent a second letter. In March. To the land registry. Yes. He was quiet another moment. Why didn't you tell me? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I wasn't sure it would do anything, and I didn't want to give you something to hope for that might come to nothing. She set down what she was holding. And because you were carrying enough already. He looked at her across the kitchen. You've been managing things I didn't know you were managing. Some of them. Why? Because I could. She said it plainly. And because they needed managing. He looked like he wanted to say something and was taking his time finding it. You know, I know. she said. But you would have done it out of necessity, and I did it because I was paying attention. There's a difference in how it lands. He held her gaze for a long moment. Yeah, he said quietly. There is. The Cheyenne hearing was in June. Rhett and Finch made the trip together, and Savannah stayed at the ranch because someone had to, and also because she understood that some things needed to be Rhett's own. His name on those documents, his voice in that room, his fight reclaimed from the man who had tried to take it in the first place. She had done what she could from Laramie. The rest belonged to him. She kept busy in the way she always kept busy, which was completely and without gap. She renegotiated the supply account terms with the Laramie store using the argument Finch had outlined, which worked better than she expected and resulted in a credit arrangement that gave the ranch breathing room through the summer. She had a long conversation with Cal Pruitt about the ranching cooperative, the one Rhett had attended the meeting for in April, and worked out the specific terms under which the Mercer Ranch could join, which required some creative accounting of the water access rights that were currently in legal dispute, but would, she was confident, be resolved. She also, on a Tuesday afternoon when the boys were doing their schoolwork at the kitchen table, sat down with Owen and had a conversation she'd been building toward for a while. I want to talk to you about something, she said. He looked up from his reader. His eyes were steady, the way they'd been steady since the night of the fire, since the word that had come out of him in the dark. Neither of them had addressed it directly. It had just been present, the way important things sometimes were. Not named, but not absent either. When you called me that, she said carefully, in the yard, after the fire. He didn't look away. I know what I said. I know you do. She kept her voice even. I want you to know. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen, and I'm not going to make it strange. But I also don't want you to feel like you owe it to me, or that it changes what I expect from you, or, I know what my mother was, Owen said. The directness of it stopped her. I know she was my mother and you're not her, and it's not the same thing. He looked at his hands, then back up. But you ran into a burning building for our horses, and you stayed, and you fought for this place before Dad knew you were fighting for it. A pause. I called you what I called you because I meant it, not because I forgot. She sat with that for a moment. Okay, she said. Okay, he said, and went back to his reader. Luke, across the table, had been listening with the complete transparency of a child who never pretended otherwise. I already decided that a long time ago, he announced, as though contributing a relevant data point. I know you did, she said. In January, he added, when you fixed the origami horse the second time. That's very specific. I remember things that matter, Luke said, which was both true and one of the most purely Luke things she'd ever heard him say. She went back to her accounts and did not let herself fall apart at the kitchen table, which took some effort. Rhett came back from Cheyenne on a Friday. She heard his horse before she saw him, and she came to the porch in the way she'd learned to, not hovering, just present, and she looked at his face when he rode into the yard. He was not a man who showed things easily, but there was something different in the set of his shoulders, something that had been there for months, the particular tension of a man bracing for what might still come, and it was gone. He dismounted and walked to the porch. Alderman ruled the amendment fraudulent, he said. It's void. The original water rights agreement stands. She exhaled. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the breath going out of her. Deckard? She asked. Formally charged with arson. He's made a deal, apparently. He's cooperating. Rhett came up the steps. He looked tired in the good way, the way of someone who has done a hard thing and come through it. Crow isn't charged yet, but Finch says the territory attorney's office is building the case. What they got from Deckard, combined with the registry findings, it's enough to keep him occupied for a long time. His grip on the county? Already loosening. Rhett leaned against the porch rail. The mill contract's been put under review. Pruitt told me 2 other ranchers who'd been afraid to say anything have gone on record with the attorney's office about their own situations. He paused. You started that. Dot started that, she said. I just asked the right questions. He looked at her with that expression she'd stopped trying to categorize. You do that a lot. Ask the right questions. Somebody has to. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the yard, at the barn that was whole again, at the late afternoon light coming across the pasture in the long, low way of June evenings. She stood beside him and looked at it too. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I want to ask you." Her heart did something she told it to stop doing. "All right." I started thinking about it in February, which is terrible timing considering. "Terrible timing," she agreed. "And then the fire, and the lawyers, and I kept telling myself to wait until things were settled." He turned to look at her. "Things are never going to be completely settled. I've realized that. There's always going to be the next thing. Usually. So I'm not waiting for settled." He straightened from the rail. "I want to ask you to stay. Not as an arrangement. Not until spring or any other deadline." He held her gaze. "I want you to marry me, Savannah. That's what I want." She looked at him. This man she'd met in a train depot in December with 2 grieving boys and a ranch on the edge of ruin, and papers in his coat that didn't add up to anything hopeful. This man who had given her a narrow room and a sticky dresser drawer and a quilt made by someone he'd loved and lost, and had not asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. "You should know," she said, "I'm not going to become someone easier to manage over time. I know that. I'm going to keep doing things without telling you about them when I think it's more efficient. I know that too. And I'm not—" She stopped, tried again. "I've spent a long time around people who looked at me and saw what was missing. I'm not willing to do that again. If that changes—" "It won't," he said. "You don't know that. Savannah." His voice was quiet. "I spent 4 months watching you rebuild this place from the inside out, while fighting a legal battle you didn't have to fight and raising my sons better than I was managing on my own. What exactly do you think I'm not seeing?" She didn't have an answer for that. She'd been preparing arguments, and he'd just removed the ground they stood on. "Yes," she said. "That's my answer." He looked at her for a moment longer, like he was making sure he'd heard it correctly. Then he crossed the porch and put his arms around her the way someone does when they've been wanting to and have decided to stop having reasons not to. And she let herself be held, which was something she didn't always allow, and which felt, in this moment, like the most honest thing she'd done in a long time. Inside the kitchen, something crashed. Luke yelled. Owen said something in a tone of profound resignation. They pulled apart and looked at the kitchen door. "Boys," Rhett called. "It was Luke," Owen called back. "It was an accident," Luke added, at the same volume. Rhett looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them could entirely hold the straight face required. The town celebration in late June was not arranged in anyone's honor. It was the annual summer gathering that had happened every year since the settlement was established. A thing of long tables in the main street and the fiddle player from 2 counties over who came every year and played until he ran out of songs and then started over. But this year it had a different quality. The news about Crow's legal situation had moved through the county in the way that news moved in small places, fast and with elaboration. And there was a feeling in the gathering of people who had been tensed against something for a long time, and were only just now allowing themselves to relax. Savannah was not someone who liked being at the center of things. She was more comfortable at the edges, watching, making sure things ran correctly. But she found herself at the center of this anyway because people kept coming to find her. Women mostly. Some she knew and some she didn't, who wanted to talk about what had happened and what it meant. And some who just wanted to say something they hadn't had occasion to say before. A woman named Ruth, who ran a boarding house on the East Road, and whom Savannah had never spoken to directly, stopped her near the food tables and said, "My husband talked to the attorney's office last week about our situation with Crow. He'd been afraid to for 3 years." She looked at Savannah directly. "He said if the Mercer woman could do what she did, he could do this much." Savannah didn't know what to say to that. "He did the hard part," she said finally. "I just gave him a place to look." Ruth nodded like that was the right answer and went back to her family. She thought about that afterward. Gave him a place to look. It wasn't a grand thing. It wasn't heroism, which was a word people had been using in the last months that she was uncomfortable with. She'd paid attention. She'd refused to decide in advance that something was impossible. She'd asked questions and kept records and written letters, and made food for strangers rebuilding a barn, and sat with a grieving child in the cold on a February porch. None of those things were extraordinary. They were just the accumulation of showing up, which was something she'd been doing her whole life and had never received credit for until now. She thought she understood something about that. The world had a way of misreading the people who did the steady, necessary, unglamorous work of keeping things together. It called them background. It called them unremarkable. It saw the surface, not presented enough, too plain, doesn't carry herself right, and stopped looking. And the people who got sorted that way had two choices: believe the assessment or keep going anyway, in the faith that the work itself knew its own value even when the people watching didn't. She'd kept going, not because she was certain. She hadn't been certain. She'd gone into that burning barn terrified, and she'd sent those letters not knowing if they'd matter. And she'd stayed on this ranch past every logical deadline because something in her had recognized, before her mind had caught up to it, that this was the place she'd been working toward her whole life without knowing what it looked like. Worth wasn't assigned by the people who failed to see it. That was the thing. She'd spent too many years in rooms where she'd been measured by people with the wrong instruments, and the measurements had been wrong. And she'd still half believed them because half belief was what years of repetition produced even when you knew better. She didn't believe them anymore. She wasn't sure exactly when that had changed. Somewhere between a paper horse in a train depot and a burning barn and a boy's voice in the dark and a man who looked at her like she was the clearest thing he'd seen. Rhett found her near the far end of the tables where it was quieter. He had Owen on one side and Luke on the other, which was the standard formation, and he was carrying 2 plates because he'd brought her food without asking, which he'd started doing sometime in March and she'd never commented on. She took the plate. Luke immediately began describing everything that had happened in the last 30 minutes, with the thoroughness of a journalist who felt the audience needed full context. Owen ate and observed and said, at one point, a single dry observation about Luke's account that made all of them laugh. And Savannah stood in the June evening with food she hadn't made herself and the sound of a fiddle carrying from somewhere down the street, and she let herself be where she was without calculating what came next. That was new. That was something she was still learning. Yeah. The water rights partnership that saved the ranch's financial footing came together in August. It was not the arrangement she'd originally imagined. The specific terms had changed 3 times through the summer as the legal situation shifted. But the final form was better than what she'd first outlined, a formal agreement with the ranching cooperative that gave the Mercer Ranch a reliable income stream from water access fees paid by 4 neighboring operations, structured in a way that made the Mercer Ranch a necessary partner rather than a dependent one. She'd negotiated most of it herself, with Finch's guidance on the legal language. Rhett had been there for all the important conversations, but she'd done the work of preparation, and he'd come to trust her preparation absolutely, which was a thing she valued more than she could easily say. Crow's formal indictment came in September. Multiple charges, including the fraudulent filings, arson conspiracy through Deckard, and a longer list of economic coercion cases that other ranchers had now brought forward. His lawyers would keep it in courts for years. She had no illusion that justice was fast or clean, but the power he'd held over the county was gone. The mill contract was terminated. The bank had severed its formal partnership arrangement under pressure from the territory. 2 of his major landholdings were under lien. The man who had been patient as a long winter had run out of seasons. Gus, when he heard the indictment news, said nothing for a moment, and then went back to repairing a hinge on the gate, which was essentially Gus throwing a party. The wedding was in October, which was Savannah's doing. She'd wanted it before the hard winter set in, and also she'd decided she was not interested in a long engagement, having spent enough of her life waiting for things she'd already decided on. It was not elaborate. The front room of the house, the neighbors who mattered, Dot Calloway, in the good dress she'd mentioned owning but never worn in Savannah's presence. Finch came down from Cheyenne, which she hadn't expected and was genuinely glad of. The fiddle player from the summer celebration was there because Rhett had thought to ask him, which was the kind of thing Rhett did quietly that she was still discovering. Owen stood beside his father. Luke stood beside Owen and spent most of the ceremony leaning to see around people, which was Luke in complete form. She wore the dress she'd brought from Cheyenne. Not a wedding dress, just a good dress, deep green, which she'd bought 3 years ago for a position she'd hoped for and never gotten, and which she'd carried through every subsequent disappointment in her traveling bag because she'd refused to stop believing there would eventually be an occasion for it. There was the occasion. Rhett looked at her in the way he looked at things he was trying to understand honestly, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment, which was fine because some things communicated better without words. The ceremony was short and real, and after it was over, Luke said too loudly, "Finally," which produced laughter from every direction, including Rhett, and Owen, who had been composed and still through the whole thing, came and stood beside her and leaned slightly against her arm in the way he had. Quiet contact, no announcement. And she put her hand briefly on his shoulder and felt him settle. Dot, passing with the food she'd brought without being asked, said quietly to Savannah, "You know you've been running this county for 6 months." "I've been helping," Savannah said. "Same thing out here." Dot moved on. Watch. In the years that followed, the Mercer Ranch became something she hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted. It happened the way organic things happened, gradually, then undeniably. The water rights partnership brought traffic and contact and relationship with neighboring operations, and those relationships brought other things. The wife of one of Pruitt's hands who had nowhere to go after a bad situation, and who stayed in the small room off the kitchen for a winter while she found her footing. A widow with 2 young children who needed work, and found it. A girl of 16 who'd been turned out, and who Owen, of all people, noticed on the road one afternoon and brought home with the particular quiet certainty of a boy who had learned something about being seen. She didn't set out to build a place for people. She just kept saying yes to the specific person in front of her, the way she'd said yes to a man in a train depot in December, and the yeses accumulated into something with a shape. Owen grew into himself in the way of children who carry heavy things early and learn to set them down rather than let them define them. He found his voice, not in the dramatic way of stories, but slowly, in the practical way of someone who discovered they had things worth saying. He had his mother's careful hands and his father's stubbornness, and something that was entirely his own, a quality of attention to the people around him that made people feel genuinely seen. By the time he was 14, he was the one bringing strays home, human and animal both, with a certainty about it that Savannah recognized from the inside. Luke never stopped being exactly Luke, loud and warm and in motion, with a particular inability to pass by something broken without trying to fix it. His reading improved slowly and then significantly, and by the time he was 12, he'd decided he was going to build things for a living. Specifically the structures that held communities together, which seemed right for him in a way that was obvious to everyone who knew him. He told Savannah once that she'd been the first person who'd explained that his brain wasn't broken, just different, and that this had changed something for him that he couldn't fully describe. She hadn't known what to do with that then, and she still didn't, years later, except to be glad she'd paid attention. Gus stayed until he didn't, which was longer than anyone had predicted. And when he left, he shook Rhett's hand and then, to everyone's surprise, including Gus's, briefly embraced Savannah before walking to his horse with the dignity of a man who had done what he'd set out to do and was complete about it. The work was never simple. There were hard winters and failed crops, and the slow grind of legal processes that took years to reach their conclusions. There were arguments and miscommunications and the particular friction of people living closely together who all had strong opinions about the right way to do things. Rhett was stubborn in the specific way of men who had managed alone for too long and had to relearn that sharing the weight was not the same as losing it. Savannah was not easy. She'd never pretended to be, and she didn't start. And there were nights they went to bed with things unresolved, and mornings when the resolution came over coffee without either of them referencing the night before, which was its own kind of language. It was not the life she'd imagined when she was younger. It was better than the life she'd imagined, in the way that real things are usually better than imagined ones, if you're honest about it. Rougher, more complicated, more surprising, with a texture that only came from actual use. She thought sometimes about that woman on the Aldridge back step in December, with the draft through her blouse and the ticket in her pocket, and the specific exhausted grief of someone who'd been measured wrong so many times they'd started to wonder if the measurements were right. She didn't think about her with pity. She thought about her with something closer to respect. That woman had kept the ticket and gotten on the train and said yes to a stranger in a depot on almost no information, not because she was brave in the classic sense, but because she was more afraid of what she'd become if she kept choosing the safe retreat. That was the whole of it, really. Not heroism, not destiny, just the decision, made over and over in different forms. Not to let other people's failure of perception become your own. The frontier had a way of stripping things to what they actually were. It didn't care what you looked like, or what you'd been told about yourself. It only cared what you did when the fire started, what you did when the child couldn't sleep, what you did when the letters needed writing and the records needed keeping and the people around you needed someone to hold the line. She'd held the line, and standing on the porch of the Mercer Ranch on a late October evening, with the smell of wood smoke in the air, and Rhett's voice somewhere inside and the sound of Owen and Luke in the yard, not arguing tonight, just talking, the low, comfortable talk of brothers. She looked out at the land that had been fought for and nearly lost and rebuilt and won, and she felt, with a completeness she hadn't known was available to her, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it was easy, not because it was finished, because she had made it, piece by piece, letter by letter, night by night, one person at a time. That was the only kind of home worth having, the kind you built yourself, out of the material of hard choices and honest work, and the willingness to keep going even when the door you came through had already closed behind you. She'd learned that in a train depot in the Wyoming winter, from a man who saw her and two boys who needed her, and a life that had been waiting for someone stubborn enough to claim it. She went back inside, the door swung shut behind her, and the light in the windows stayed on.